Turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for being here this evening, and for the invitation. Thank you to the Brookings Mountain West program for the invitation to be here and address you this evening. I'm happy to be here. The Brookings Mountain West program, of course, covers a very broad spectrum of policy areas. And I am here to talk specifically about education, and I feel like this is an important area of public policy for a lot of different reasons, but one thing that's particularly relevant here in the Mountain West is that, of course, it is one of the state's primary functions. It's one of the ways the state invests in the future of the state, and this is the way that we can try to shape policy or use research to shape policy, and I'm excited to share with you some of the research findings that have come across or have emerged from the literature on teacher quality and students' access to teacher quality. Okay, so to begin, let's talk about why, if I'm leading a discussion about public education, why I'm going straight to teachers. The quote that I'm putting up here is from President Obama. It expresses the idea nicely, so let me read it for you. From the moment students enter a school, the most important factor in their success is not the color of their skin or the income of their parents, it's the person standing at the front of the classroom. America's future depends on its teachers. Okay? Of course, there is a lot of nuance here embedded in this message that we can discuss, and I plan to discuss quite a bit of that during this lecture. But the essence of that captures what I want to that I want to convey, which is teachers are extremely important, and indeed one of, if not the most important factor in producing, in helping our students to learn and to grow. Okay? So given the importance of teachers in public education, an important and pressing policy question is whether all students have equal access to high-quality teachers. Okay? This is the motivating question behind the comments that I'm going to deliver to you today. And by the end, I hope that you have an understanding of teachers, teacher quality, access to teachers, and accountability, and how this plays a role in this field. Now, to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert, the situation about student access to teachers and quality teaching is actually not nearly as bad as commonly believed. Okay? But there's still work to do. So we can't just wash our hands and walk away. So this is an overview of what I'll be speaking to you today. First, I'm going to be I'll be leading off the discussion by framing this around performance and accountability, both for schools and teachers as the agents within those schools. Then I'm going to talk about 3 myths for these teachers in schools that are commonly used that frame our thinking about students and whether they have access to quality teaching or not. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with some potential strategies that we can think about in moving forward and trying to expand access to quality teaching. So first, let's look at this on a very macro level, and let's look at international comparisons of how United States schools are performing relative to other countries. Okay, there's a lot of bullets here. You can read them closely as you like, but let me give you the high-level view. The TIMSS test is a test that is an international assessment that measures student performance in math and science in elementary and middle school grades. The United States, in general, is doing about average or perhaps slightly above average on the TIMSS test. Okay, so this is relatively good news. We're not the top performer, but we're not too far down the list. The PISA test, and the PISA test is down here towards the bottom. The PISA test looks at upper high school grades, and it measures it assesses students in reading, science, and math. Here, the U.S. is, if anything, slightly below the OECD average. Okay? So, in these early and elementary and elementary and middle school grades, we are slightly above average. By the time we're getting to high school, we're average or perhaps even slightly below average, so we have a little bit of a decline in performance as we matriculate up through the grades. That decline as we go up also reflects overall trends based on the NAEP, so the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is also commonly referred to as the nation's report card. What it has showed is that over the last 2 or 3 decades, and particularly during the accountability period started after No Child Left Behind Act, the United States has experienced generally a gain in grades 4 and grade 8 on the NAEP. However, we don't see corresponding gains as those students are approaching in their high school grades and are being tested in their high school grades. So we see this on international tests. We see a roughly corresponding pattern on United States tests as well. So we have some work to do. Now let's zoom in on states. And I'm here as part of the Brookings Mountain West program, so I'm focusing on the 6 Mountain West states presented before you on the table. So let's first look at these rankings here. Now, again, this is based on the NAEP. This is the most recent NAEP testing that was done, and it was assessed in 2013 by the time it comes out, and then the report gets written on it, etc. What this shows is that Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico are all in the 40s or 50. Okay, so this is out of 51 states, well, 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And Colorado, Idaho, and Utah are above the median. Okay? So, of course, we know that there is quite a difference, demographically speaking, between the former group and the latter group. And if we were to adjust these rankings based on student demographics, and this is an analysis based on Matt Chingos' work from the Urban Institute, when he adjusted those rankings, what this does is it actually pushes up slightly the rankings of Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico, so they're not doing nearly as poorly as they were before. Both Nevada and New Mexico get a big bump up. Colorado, Idaho, and Utah, because they're demographically more affluent and white than the average states in the country. So they actually, all of these are penalized and they're pushed slightly downwards. The main point that I want to get at is that with the exception of Colorado, 5 of these 6 mountain West states, are significantly below the national average. Okay? So education is clearly something that is an important public investment that we need for the Mountain West region, but we're clearly not doing very well. The final column includes student spending per student. All 6 states spend less than $10,000 per student. The national average per pupil spending is nearly $13,000. So these are all at least 20% or so lower, and some are more than 20% lower than the national per student average. Of course, we could say this is relatively lower cost of living, et cetera, et cetera. So there are perhaps some mitigating circumstances in that comparison, but I feel like I'm not out of place to say there's generally an underinvestment in education in the Mountain West region. Now, and I guess, and that's coming from somebody who is a product of Mountain West high schools. So just to be clear. Now, there now let's, having taken this sort of larger big picture comparing how our performance is doing, let's now take this as a segue into accountability and the role of accountability here in education policy specifically. So over the last 15 years in public education, there has been an increasing trend towards more accountability. Okay? The No Child Left Behind Act, so abbreviated here as NCLB, it was passed by Congress in 2001 on the heels of September 11th. It was enacted the following, just a few weeks later in January of 2002. It was signed. But it is commonly assigned a lot of blame for the accountability pressures that we see in our public schools today. Okay? And however, I'm going to perhaps dispute that or add a little nuance to that somewhat. Okay? Though I don't disagree with the fact that No Child Left Behind has played a large role in increasing accountability pressure, I'm going to argue that it is certainly not the only factor that has gone into the accountability pressure. Okay? As a way to support that, first off, many states, including Texas, where George W. Bush was from and governor of, and of course he was the one that signed No Child Left Behind to put it into law. These early accountability states like Texas were a model for No Child Left Behind. So there was already accountability happening in several states independent of the federal law. So there was this push already going on. Furthermore, No Child Left Behind, or the accountability specifically in education, seen in context of a larger accountability push across many public industries, or not necessarily public industries per se, but publicly focused industries, whether they're private or public. There have been many pressures have been mounting in these industries as well for accountability. So, as an example, healthcare, welfare, financial services, these are all experiencing ratcheting up of accountability pressures. Okay? So I feel like a lot of this accountability, of course, we can look at several reasons. One important reason is that this is a consequence of greater data availability. So technology, computers have become so cheap, so easy to collect data, so easy to store and manage that data, that it seems a natural thing to begin to use that data to measure how funds are being used and what are the outcomes that those funds are buying. And so given all of this nexus of influences, I feel like I'm on pretty solid ground when I say accountability is here to stay in public education. Okay? Some of you may know that we had a new education law that was enacted in December of last year, the Every Student Succeeds Act. The Every Student Succeeds Act basically is replacing No Child Left Behind. Okay? And it was written up in the media, in media reports, as basically an entire rewrite of No Child Left Behind, and just sort of going back to the beginning and kicking the Fed out of education. That's not entirely true. There is some truth to that. But importantly, what it did not do is it did not change the testing requirements that were originally put in place under No Child Left Behind. So there's still annual testing in grades 3 through 8 for all public school students. And so there is still a major focus on school accountability, though states have some flexibility on how they implement that accountability now that they didn't have previously. But my argument is that accountability for schools is here to stay. Next, let's talk about how this affects teachers. I feel like over the last several years, so the later period it had been almost 15 years from the time No Child Left Behind was enacted until ESSA came to replace it. ESSA is that new law. During that 15 years, the first 7 or 8 years weren't exactly a honeymoon period, but things were not quite to a boiling point. And then in those last half of that time period, things did get to more of a boiling point. And of course, this is the time of the Great Recession. And so schools are under a lot of pressure financially. And there was a lot of policy action that was taking place in order to try to spur schools to try to do something new in order to try to work with the No Child Left Behind restrictions. And so there was basically these federal initiatives called Race to the Top and waivers to the No Child Left Behind provisions that were offered for schools that if they were to enact teacher evaluation policies to focus the accountability more directly on teachers, then they would be able to qualify for dollars. They would be able to qualify for waivers from what were generally perceived as pretty onerous requirements under No Child Left Behind. Okay, so and in that latter half of the 15-year period between laws, most states actually did revamp their teacher evaluation systems. It was over 30 states. I don't have the number in front of me right now. But many states have made these changes. And so even though No Child Left Behind's original language focused on school accountability, it has morphed into teacher accountability as well. Okay? Now, this morphing from one to the other, it seems somewhat natural. After all, education is a very labor-intensive industry. In all districts, well, in most all districts, labor expenditures are over 50% of the budget. They're typically around 60 or so percent. And so this is a very important part of what schools are doing, and if we want to hold schools accountable, we should be holding teachers accountable. So goes the logic. And of course, there's also research to support this position to focus on teachers as well. There have been recent studies, and a lot of these studies have been possible now because of this flood of data coming from these annual tests that are being done, also from federal programs like the state longitudinal data grants that have been happening. And we've had research that shows that teachers matter a great deal to to students. Okay? Not only do they matter in improving their test scores in the immediate period, but they also matter on a range of long-term outcomes. Okay? So these are outcomes including college attendance, the quality of the college that you attend, higher wages once you're employed, and it also has been associated with the likelihood that a woman gets pregnant as a teenager. Okay? And has a child as a teenager. I don't know about pregnancy specifically. But, and so there are a lot of important outcomes and policy relevant outcomes that are associated with having higher quality teachers. And so therefore, it's very natural then to focus our accountability pressures on those teachers. Now, that's not to say that, this was supposed to be animated. I apologize. So you were supposed to see one chart once and then another chart second. I failed to do the animation. I apologize about that. However, let me describe what you're seeing. So just because accountability pressure is coming in doesn't make it a popular thing, because it's certainly not very popular among teachers. Okay? So what I'm showing you, this is a survey of teachers, or excuse me, it's of the public, and there is a subsample of teachers administered as part of this survey. Okay? When surveying teachers, or excuse me, when administering this survey, the public and teachers were asked, are you in favor of using using performance to pay teachers differently. Okay, so that's the merit pay question that you see in the background, but you can't see very well. Or are you in favor of using teacher performance based on test scores to award teachers with tenure? Okay? What you see, and this is illustrated very nicely with the merit pay graph that's covered up, but what you see is that there is a difference, and we're looking at Republicans and Democrats, and then we're looking at the teachers on the green line. Okay? So what you see is that Republicans and Democrats, yes, there's a little bit of a difference in their opinions on this issue, but that difference is actually not very large. Okay? On teacher tenure, there is a little bit more of a difference here, but still, if you're comparing this gap to the gap between teachers and the general public overall, it's pretty different. And so while the public may have a favorable perception of these kinds of policies, teachers themselves do not. So that's not to say, however, that they don't want to be evaluated at all. This is from a different, this slide is from a different survey where it's specifically looking at teachers, and it's asking teachers about their attitudes towards being evaluated and whether they want to be evaluated more or less often. Okay? And looking at the total overall results, you see 60% say they're being evaluated at just about the right frequency. 24% say they should be evaluated less often. 17% say they should be evaluated more often. But if we actually break that out by the number of times that they're actually being evaluated, we see that those who are never evaluated have a high demand for actually being evaluated. And then, of course, those who are being evaluated more than once a year, they're the ones who are saying, I don't want to be evaluated as much as I am. Okay? Now, though I don't have a graphic of this, this survey probed a little bit further and asked what they value about being evaluated. And many teachers, a high majority of teachers, 70% plus, report valuing evaluations that are formative, that help them to identify areas of weakness in their practice and help them improve. They like evaluations to help them to understand, to just give them critical feedback on what they could be doing, better. So it seems that putting this survey's results juxtaposing that against that survey's results, it appears that decoupling evaluations from high-stakes decisions, it seems maybe perhaps a winning strategy. Okay, so I'm going to talk that will come into play a little bit later, but I just want to put that out there for now. Okay, so let's now transition to myths that we commonly hear about teachers and schools. Okay, myth number one. Okay, well, these are the myths. Now I'll just hop into myth number one. Myth number one: the most affluent districts have the best schools. Okay? I'm sure probably many of us have heard this in some variant or other, right? Let's move to this part of town because that's where the best schools are, right? So if we were to look at the proficiency measures that are generated under No Child Left Behind accountability, which shows the percentage of students that are proficient on state standards, against a state standard, then we will find results that are going to reinforce that myth. Okay? Which is, we're going to find very low proficiency rates in very disadvantaged neighborhoods. We're going to have very high proficiency rates in the most affluent neighborhoods. Okay? So if we just focus on the proficiency rates alone, we are going to have this myth reinforced. However, one of the things that No Child Left Behind did was it also had a component which was also measuring the progress on proficiency rates. Okay? And these, if you're looking at progress on proficiency rates, those measures actually told a very different story about schools. Unfortunately, these adequate yearly progress measures, commonly referred to in the industry as AYP, they became a poster child for well-intended but poorly implemented policy measures. And because they had aspirations to ratchet up over time to 100% proficiency by the year 2014. And because of that poor implementation, they were generally criticized, and they actually didn't gather much attention aside from criticism. However, they were actually useful measures, and the reason why they were useful measures is because they're trying to get a measure of growth and seeing how students are improving over time. Now, of course, the proficiency measures alone are not great measures of how all students are doing, because they ignore gains that are happening on the higher end or low end of the spectrum. So we can debate about that, but suffice it to say that if we're looking at growth-based measures, so how students are doing over time rather than looking at where they are at a single point in time, then that gives us a better sense of how schools are actually doing in improving those students. Okay? And so what I'm talking about here is a misattribution problem. So typically, when we are saying that the most affluent districts have the best schools, what's happening is we are attributing all the scholastic success of those students to the schools, when we know that those students in those schools are already advantaged in many different ways. Okay? They have a stronger set of peers. They have a lot of advantages from their family background. And this has been measured in multiple different ways. There are vocabulary gaps at the time they enter kindergarten. There are IQ gaps. There are spoken word gaps, etc. And so there are many different ways that we can measure these gaps, and these gaps are already existing even before they enter the schools. Okay? Once they're in schools, they actually don't spread out that much. Those gaps do increase a little bit over time and as students matriculate through schools, but it's not as much as the gaps that they've initially arrived with, right? So that's what I'm talking about is this misattribution problem. We commonly look at poor student performance in general, those poor levels of performance, and where we could probably mostly attribute those to background, we are commonly attributing those to schools. Okay? So while there is so the fact check here is that good schools exist in all types of neighborhoods. That's not to say that all neighborhoods, that's not to say that there is no relationship between poverty and school performance, but it's not nearly as strong as commonly believed. So as an example, here is a scatter plot of the percentage of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So this is our best measure of poverty in a school. And when you have 100% of students who are eligible, this is the most concentrated poverty among all the districts, or among all schools. And so you see, on average, these are certainly worse performing schools. And so these are standard deviations of value-added performance. These are gains in student test scores. So we definitely see that on average, these schools are performing worse than these more affluent schools. However, there are a lot of really high poverty schools that are actually performing exceptionally. And similarly, you're going to have quite a few schools that are going to be in this very low poverty category that are really not serving their students very well. Okay? And so I hope that by this point we have successfully dispelled the myth that the most affluent districts or the most affluent neighborhoods have the best schools. Okay? Now, we could talk about different types of peers, which they do have different types of peers, and I'm not disputing that, but they don't have, but we don't want to conflate peer differences in peers with differences in school quality. Okay? Next thing, next myth that we want to talk about is we know what good teaching is and how to screen for the best teachers. Okay? And the reason why we want to screen for the best teachers is because we want to make sure we have a high-quality teacher workforce in front of our students. Okay? This is a myth. Okay? This is a myth because good teaching truly is a black box. We don't understand exactly the magic formula that makes a good teacher good and weak teachers not so good. Okay? I have this chart that helps to illustrate what different things that go into this black box. Okay? So we can think of ingredients into the black box, and these are things like a teacher's licensure or certification. These are things that a teacher has at the time that he or she arrives at the classroom door before they actually enter. Okay? They have licensure or certification. They have educational attainment and degrees. They have prior experience, perhaps, teaching. They also can undergo professional development to improve their practice. And all of these are inputs into the problem. Okay? We also have outcomes that we can look at that we care about, and some of these outcomes are things like student test scores. Okay? I'll get to the discussion of these other pieces in a moment. But so what I want to illustrate is that under No Child Left Behind, we had some provisions called the the highly qualified teacher provisions that required that states and districts monitor the qualifications of the teachers that were in their classrooms. And those measures were all focused on these inputs. Okay? Now, the problem with this is that I have a teacher qualifications versus teacher quality dilemma set up here. And the reason why I have it as a versus, is a confrontational thing, is because these qualifications don't actually do a very good job of predicting how a teacher is going to perform in the classroom. Okay? And so if we focus specifically on those inputs as the highly qualified teacher provisions did, then we're actually not getting a very great measure of who is a good teacher or not. Okay? And unfortunately, measuring teacher quality is much easier said than done. We know, of course, that measuring teachers is just more than test scores, but test scores are generally the least costly way to measure performance. Okay? Now, what these other entries on the table here, these are other ways that we could try to measure performance. Okay? So we can think of process-based measures. So these are measures that we're trying to get inside the black box. So we can look at observational ratings, we can look at peer review of teachers, we can look at student surveys of how the teachers are doing in the classroom, or we can look at different kinds of outcomes. And so we can look at test scores, SLOs, these are student learning objectives. This is a kind of measure that states have begun to adopt. We can look at student surveys again, or non-tested outcomes like student absences or student suspensions. Now, we could go into a much deeper discussion about each of these individual points, but the way that we're measuring teacher quality, but there's a lot of conversations going on within the research community about the best way to measure teacher quality. It turns out that each of these individual measures, they are correlated with each other. That means that if you're a good measure on value added, you also tend to be a good teacher based on observational ratings. However, that correlation is pretty low. Okay, so it's probably the correlation measures are typically in the neighborhood of about 0.1 to 0.2. Okay, so that doesn't sound like a very high correlation. Okay, It's not zero, it's not negative, which is comforting, but they're not great measures. And so, therefore, because we don't have this high correlation between our measures of quality, it's hard to really say which ones we should prioritize over the others. And so there's some debate about exactly how we go about doing that. Now, the reason why we may want to choose different types of performance measures, this is influenced by what we intend to do with those evaluations once we have them. Okay? Now, because if we are thinking of evaluations specifically to use as a summative rating and to either pay teachers more or to award tenure or to fire them, etc., with these kinds of high-stakes decisions, then we're going to perhaps have different kinds of criteria in determining what kind of evaluation system we want and what kind of measures are part of that system. However, if we want a more formative use of evaluations, then we're going to be using that differently. Okay, let's progress to myth number 3. Myth number 3 is related to myth number 1, so you'll see some of the same arguments here, but let's talk about it. So the most affluent schools have the best teachers. Okay? So we already talked about the misattribution problem once, so I'm going to just sort of recap it. It's lurking in the background here again. So whenever we see the students coming out of this teacher's classroom and they all scored really, really well, and that those are in the most affluent schools, then there's reason to believe that perhaps part of the reason why they're scoring really well is because of the backgrounds that they're coming from, and not necessarily because of that teacher. Okay? So we want to what we're trying to do is disentangle these things that are confounded otherwise. Okay? But this myth is actually somewhat true based on the empirical findings. Okay? So, based on our typical credentials that we think about for teachers, so experience, teaching, educational attainment, licensure, these kinds of credentials that I just mentioned a moment ago as inputs, these have been identified, and it's been in several states and districts. We know that the most affluent kids have greater access to teachers with those kinds of credentials. And based on that, we see there has been a lot of growing interest in increasing disadvantaged students' access to quality to teaching to qualified teachers. Okay, now hearkening back to what I just described a few moments ago, we know that those types of qualifications are actually not very good predictors of teacher quality. Okay, and what we have been able to, and so a project that I was associated with, that I was involved with, this was the access to quality teaching for disadvantaged students. What we did is we got data from 29 different school districts. These are anonymized school districts. We got access to their data, and we measured what is the actual gap in teacher quality between these districts. And this is teacher quality based on standardized test scores. And let's ignore the gap based on teacher qualifications. So we're ignoring the experience gap and educational attainment gap, etc. So what I'm showing you here is one of the graphs from that report. And there are two takeaway messages that I want to describe here from that report. First off, the mean gap was about 2% of a standard deviation. Okay? This is a relatively small gap. It's actually significant. We were all surprised, all of us working on the project, we were all surprised at how small the gap was. Okay? Because we expected, based on the qualifications gap, we expected this to be considerably larger. So this is very good news. This is good news that disadvantaged students are not suffering from low access to teacher quality as much as we thought. However, there is still some work to be done. So there's still a gap across these districts. Okay. Also, another point that I want to make note of here is that there was a high degree of variance between these school districts. So some of these districts actually were very low or close to zero, so some of them had zero in their confidence intervals. Some were even negative, which means that the disadvantaged students actually had access to higher quality teaching than the non-disadvantaged students did. But then there were some of these districts that were far outliers, and so these were significantly greater. Now, I can't tell you where Clark County schools are on this map. I mean, they weren't actually part of the project. But it's the main point is that it's not nearly the overall quality is not nearly overall gap in teacher quality is not nearly as big as we thought, and so there's some comfort we can take here. But it's still an important issue that we want to focus on. Now, I do have a note here. There are implications from this for desegregation proposals. Okay, so many have promoted the idea that we should have more integrated schools in order to improve student performance and to have smaller concentrations of poverty. Based on this graph, and based on the findings from this report in general, would equalizing access to quality teachers, we could say that that's not exactly the same, but almost the same as equalizing or entirely fully integrating a school system based on students. They would be equivalent propositions, at least effectively equivalent propositions. Not in practice they would not be the same. But what this says is that there would be a gain from doing this, but that gain is not nearly as big as we think, as commonly is purported in different discussions of desegregation. Okay? So would disadvantaged students benefit from a desegregated school? Yes. Are they? But it's not nearly as big as we think. If your currently segregated schools are really on this low end of the spectrum, you have a lot more to gain, but that's because you're currently sorted at a very high level. Okay? But in general, across most districts, we don't expect a very large difference. Okay? So finally, I want to conclude by talking about strategies for how we can move forward with promoting greater access to effective teachers. Okay? So what I first want to start with is talking about less direct influence of teacher quality and and measurement of teachers, and a more indirect approach to managing the teacher quality that we have. Okay? So there are potentially two ways that we could think about doing this, and maybe there are more. But these are new ideas that have been floated around in research, and I think are worth pursuing and learning more about and experimenting with, as is beginning to get done in some places. But let's talk about what those are. So the first is that we can use teacher evaluations, to help teachers improve. Okay? So in general, up until recently, teacher evaluations have been, by and large, agreed upon as a relatively straightforward process. The principal comes in, observe your classroom for 30 minutes, you have a discussion afterwards, but there is no qualitative impact on how you're doing, or no high quality feedback or anything. Now, many have argued that if we just did a better job of doing better evaluations, even if we didn't necessarily attach high stakes to them, that they could of themselves be helpful. And there's some emerging evidence that it is helpful. Just by providing that signal of how teachers are doing and giving them that feedback, that prompts many teachers to respond in some way. Some teachers may be a little bit discouraged, and they may leave the profession. And perhaps if these are low-performing teachers, exceptionally low-performing teachers, perhaps that's not a bad thing. And of course, some they may see this low evaluation, and they are prompted to improve, and they try to do better. And so we have seen evidence of both of those responses based on evaluation, high-quality evaluations. Also, we can use those evaluations to try different types of professional development. So there's a recent study that was pairing, this is out of Tennessee, where they were pairing low-performing teachers based on specific rubrics of their evaluation with high-performing teachers on those exact same rubrics. They paired them together. The high-performing teacher is the teacher coach, and they worked together for a year. At the end of that year, the low-performing teacher improved significantly. Okay? So this is a much higher payoff and investing in teachers, in the teachers that we already have, than any kind of professional development that we've really seen. Okay? In general, most kinds of professional development, the way it's typically done in most districts, there's not really a payoff in terms of student learning. But this is a study that was able to show a really significant payoff. I mean, it's not a typical professional development program, but this is a way that they could get developed as professionals and improve their performance significantly. Okay? Next, we could look at using performance data to staff teachers in non-traditional ways. Okay? If we were to simply use the same staffing model of a teacher to a classroom of 25 or so kids, then we are going to need a lot more high-quality teachers in order to improve performance. However, if we were to change the model such that we were to allocate more students to the highest qualified teachers and fewer students to the least effective teachers, then we are effectively providing more access to quality teaching without actually changing the workforce. Okay? I argue that this is also a way that we could go about improving access to teacher quality without the political blowback associated with these more high-stakes policies. Okay? There's a group out of North Carolina called Public Impact. They have this suite of initiatives this suite of models under the umbrella of the Opportunity Culture Initiative. And so they have several models somewhat akin to what I just described, where they're trying to think outside of the box and how we can change how we staff schools and how we think about staffing teachers across students in order to provide more students access to the most effective teachers. Okay? So, and finally, we come to this last point, which is maybe we also have our own misattribution problem going on here. So as I said at the very beginning, I started by talking about public education, and I made a beeline for teachers. Now, it's possible that while teachers we know are very, very important, they are not necessarily the only important thing, and they interact with their schools and the context of the schools in which they are working. So what that means is that these teachers, they work with principals, they work with colleagues, they work with administrators who may or may not be supportive. And so the context in which teachers are teaching appears to be an extremely important thing that is predictive of both a teacher's quality in the classroom, their ability to perform in the classroom. It's also predictive of how long they're going to stay and their job satisfaction. And so though there has not been a lot of research to date, at least that has made this link between school context and student outcomes, there is some, but not a lot. This is an area that is showing some promise of being a way to help. We can improve access to quality teaching by improving the context in which those teachers are performing their jobs. Okay? And finally, there's something to be said about the value of school curriculum. Okay? By and large, the value of curriculum is ignored in empirical research on education policy. And the reason why it's ignored is because we don't have any data. It's not systematically collected by states or school districts, which is surprising because a lot of money is spent on curriculum, and it makes and it could potentially make a very important, has important implications for teachers and for the students. But yet we have actually done very little to monitor it and track it. There are a couple of studies that have looked at curriculum, and these studies show that there are some curricula that have very, very strong impacts on student achievement. The attractive thing about focusing on curricula rather than focusing exclusively on teachers is that, okay, well, it's not very politically divisive, for one. Second, we're already spending money on curriculum anyway. May as well spend money on the high-quality curriculum rather than the low-quality curriculum. So it's a somewhat cost-neutral approach, not exactly cost-neutral, because we still have to convince people to change. But there is an argument that we could be more strategic in that direction, and that would enable all teachers to perform at a higher level. So I thank you. That concludes my lecture for this evening. I thank you for being here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Tracking. Does any of this research give any insights into tracking strategies?
So the short answer is the teacher quality literature has focused a lot on tracking, but we have focused a lot on tracking to try to eliminate the potential bias that tracking would induce in trying to measure quality teaching.
Some teachers might be better at one end of the spectrum and others at another end of the spectrum.
Okay, and so that